I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who could do something this cold. But there I was, standing at the window of my empty living room, watching Brandon's silver SUV pull into the driveway. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The sold sign had just been hammered into our front lawn 20 minutes earlier, and I'd timed it perfectly. I wanted him to see it the moment he arrived home. Through the glass, I watched his face change. First confusion, then shock, then something that looked like pure panic. Cassidy was in the passenger seat, bold as anything, and I could see her mouth forming the words, "What's happening?" In the back seat were her parents and her brother. All 5 of them had just spent 2 glorious weeks at a lake house together, playing happy family. While I'd been here, erasing every trace of our 12 years together. Brandon's hands were shaking as he tried his key in the front door. I'd already left through the back, my bags packed and waiting in Carlos's truck around the corner, but I couldn't resist watching this moment. I'd earned it. The lock didn't turn because I'd changed them 5 days ago. I watched him peer through the windows, his face going white when he saw the empty rooms inside. That's when I allowed myself a small, cold smile. Then I turned away, walked out the back door for the last time, and got into my brother's truck. We had a flight to catch. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started, 3 months before that perfect moment of revenge. It was a Tuesday night in late March when I first knew, truly knew, that something was wrong. Brandon had been acting strange for weeks, maybe even months if I'm honest. He'd started going to the gym every morning at 5, which he'd never done before. He bought new cologne, expensive stuff that smelled nothing like the cheap drugstore brand he'd worn for years. His phone became like a third arm, always in his hand, always face down on any surface. But it was the way he looked at me that hurt most. Like I was furniture. Like I was just something that existed in his space but didn't really matter. We'd been married for 12 years, together for 14. We had Thomas, our beautiful 8-year-old boy who loved dinosaurs and building block towers that reached the ceiling. I thought we were happy. I thought we were a team. That Tuesday, I was cleaning our bedroom when I found the credit card statement. Brandon usually handled all the bills, but this one had fallen behind the dresser. I picked it up, intending to just put it on his desk, but something made me look at it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the universe trying to tell me what I'd been refusing to see. Hotel room charges. 3 different hotels over the past month. Expensive restaurants I'd never been to. A jewelry store purchase for $600. I hadn't received any jewelry. Flowers from an upscale florist, delivered to an address I didn't recognize. All told, over $3,000 in a single month on things that had nothing to do with me or Thomas. My hands went numb. I sat down on the edge of our bed, the bed where we'd made love, where we'd comforted each other through hard times, where Thomas had crawled in between us on Saturday mornings for cuddles. And I knew. Every cell in my body knew what these charges meant. I didn't confront him that night. I'm not sure why. Maybe because once I said the words out loud, it would become real. Maybe because some part of me still wanted to be wrong. So I smiled when he came home. I made dinner. I kissed him goodnight. And I died a little inside. The next morning after Brandon left for work and I'd dropped Thomas at school, I did something I never imagined I'd do. I called a private investigator. His name was Gerald Simmons, and he came highly recommended from a friend whose sister had gone through a messy divorce. Gerald was in his 50s, professional, and surprisingly kind when I started crying in his office while explaining what I'd found. "Mrs. Hartley," he said gently, "I know this is hard, but if your husband is having an affair, you need to know and you need proof before you make any decisions." 2 weeks. That's all it took for Gerald to destroy my entire world. He called me on a Thursday afternoon and asked if I could come to his office. I knew from his voice that he'd found something bad. I left Thomas with my neighbour, telling her I had a doctor's appointment. Gerald's desk was covered with photographs. Brandon and a woman, young, pretty, with long dark hair, kissing in a parking lot. Brandon and the same woman holding hands at a restaurant. Brandon and this woman entering a hotel together. The timestamps showed this had been going on for over a year. A year. While I'd been home taking care of our son, working on my freelance design projects, making dinners and packing lunches and being a good wife. A whole year. "Her name is Cassidy Monroe," Gerald said quietly. "She works in his department, sales coordinator." Of course she did. The late nights at work suddenly made sense. The team-building events, the important client dinners I'd never been invited to. But Gerald wasn't finished. He pulled out more papers, these ones printed emails and text messages. He'd gotten them from Cassidy's social media, which she apparently didn't make private. Stupid girl. There's something else you need to know, Gerald said. Her family knows about the affair. In fact, they seem to approve of it. He showed me Facebook posts from Cassidy's mother, Diane, commenting on photos of Brandon and Cassidy together. You two look so perfect together, and can't wait to make this official. There were pictures of Brandon at what looked like a Monroe family barbecue. Brandon playing basketball with Cassidy's younger brother, Justin. Brandon sitting at their family dinner table. He'd been living a double life. A whole secret life with this woman and her family, while I sat at home wondering why my husband didn't love me anymore. I didn't cry in Gerald's office. I think I was too shocked, too numb. I took the envelope of evidence, thanked him, and drove home in a daze. I picked up Thomas from school, helped him with his homework, made spaghetti for dinner, his favourite. Brandon texted that he'd be late. Client meeting, he wrote. I wondered if Cassidy was his client now. After Thomas went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with Gerald's envelope. I could confront Brandon. I could cry and scream and demand to know why I wasn't enough. I could beg him to end it and choose his family. That's what the old Nina would have done. The Nina who believed that love could fix anything. But something had shifted inside me. Maybe it was seeing that credit card statement and realizing he'd spent money on another woman that should have gone to Thomas's college fund. Maybe it was the photos of him smiling with Cassidy's family like he belonged there. Maybe it was the simple fact that he'd looked me in the eyes every single day for over a year and lied. I opened my laptop and searched for divorce attorneys. The first name that came up was Patricia Wells, known as the Destroyer in local divorce circles. Her reviews said she was ruthless, expensive, and worth every penny. I sent her an email with all of Gerald's evidence attached. She responded within an hour. Can you come to my office tomorrow at 9? We need to talk strategy. And Nina, don't tell your husband anything yet. I wouldn't, because I wasn't going to beg Brandon to stay. I was going to make sure that when I left, he'd never forget what he lost. The morning after I contacted Patricia Wells, I woke up next to my husband and felt absolutely nothing. Brandon was snoring softly, one arm thrown over his face, completely unaware that the woman lying beside him knew everything. I stared at the ceiling and wondered how I'd ever loved this man enough to marry him. I made breakfast like always, pancakes for Thomas, coffee for Brandon. I smiled when Brandon kissed my cheek before leaving for work, probably to see her. I waved goodbye, and the moment his car disappeared around the corner, I grabbed my purse and headed to Patricia's office. Patricia Wells was nothing like I expected. She was in her early 50s, with sharp grey eyes and an even sharper suit. Her office walls were covered with framed newspaper articles about high-profile divorces she'd won. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. I've reviewed everything you sent, she said, spreading Gerald's photographs across her massive desk. Your husband is an idiot. The evidence here is rock solid. But Nina, I need to know something before we proceed. Do you want to just divorce him, or do you want to destroy him? I blinked. What's the difference? A divorce means we file papers, divide assets fairly, work out custody, and you both move on with your lives. Destroying him means we use every legal tool available to make sure he regrets what he did. It means we hit him where it hurts most. His wallet, his reputation, his comfort. Which one do you want? I thought about Brandon laughing at Cassidy's family barbecue while I sat home alone. I thought about the $600 in jewelry I never received. I thought about my son asking why Daddy was always too busy to play with him anymore. I want him to feel what I felt, I said quietly. I want him to know what it's like to have everything ripped away without warning. Patricia smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Good. Then here's what we're going to do. Over the next hour, Patricia laid out a plan so thorough it took my breath away. First, we'd gather more evidence. Gerald would continue surveillance. Second, we'd quietly start protecting my assets, opening new bank accounts, documenting everything I'd brought into the marriage. Third, and most important, we'd wait for the perfect opportunity. He'll make a mistake, Patricia said. Cheaters always do. They get confident, sloppy. When he does, we strike fast and hard. The opportunity came 2 weeks later. Brandon announced at dinner that he needed to take 2 weeks off work for a guy's camping trip with some college friends. He'd already cleared it with his boss. He'd leave next Friday and be back in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, I said, keeping my voice light and supportive. That's a long trip. You haven't seen those guys in years. I know, but we're not getting any younger. Figured it was now or never. He wouldn't meet my eyes when he said it. The moment Brandon left for work the next morning, I called Gerald. Follow him this week. I need to know if this camping trip is real. It took Gerald exactly 3 days to confirm what I already knew. There was no camping trip. Brandon had rented a lake house in his own name, another stupid move, for himself, Cassidy, and her entire family. Gerald showed me the rental agreement. 2 weeks at a luxury property with a boat dock and hot tub. Brandon had paid for everything. When I showed Patricia, her eyes lit up like Christmas morning. 2 weeks. He's giving you 2 weeks with him completely out of the picture. Nina, do you know what we can accomplish in 2 weeks? Tell me. Everything. Patricia made some calls. Within hours, we had a meeting scheduled with Judge Richard Morrison for the following Monday, 3 days before Brandon's trip. Patricia had worked with Judge Morrison before, and apparently he had strong feelings about infidelity after his own wife's affair years ago. We're going to petition for emergency temporary full ownership of the house, Patricia explained, based on abandonment and adultery. The house was purchased with your inheritance money before the marriage, correct? Yes. My grandmother left me $200,000. We used it as a down payment and put both names on the deed because Brandon said that's what married people do. Do you have documentation proving that money came from your inheritance? I did. I'd kept all the paperwork from my grandmother's estate. Patricia actually hugged me when I showed her. This changes everything. That house is legally more yours than his. With the right judge and the right circumstances, we can get you temporary full ownership, and once you have that, you can sell it. My heart started pounding. Sell it? Sell our house? Why not? You're getting divorced anyway. The house would be divided in the settlement, but if you sell it now while he's gone, for cash to a quick buyer, he comes home to nothing. No house, no wife, just divorce papers and an empty lot. It was cruel. It was extreme. It was perfect. The next week was a blur of activity. Patricia filed the emergency petition. Gerald provided sworn statements and photographic evidence of the affair. I met with Judge Morrison in his chambers, bringing Thomas's baby book and our wedding album to show what Brandon was throwing away. Judge Morrison was a grandfather with kind eyes that turned ice cold when he looked at the photos of Brandon and Cassidy. Mrs. Hartley, I'm granting your petition for temporary full ownership based on abandonment, adultery, and the fact that the property was purchased primarily with your premarital assets. You have 2 weeks to do whatever you need to do. After that, we'll revisit this in the formal divorce proceedings. I actually cried when he signed the order. Patricia squeezed my hand. Now the fun part, she said. Let's sell a house. Monica Reed was a real estate agent who specialized in quick sales. Patricia connected us the same day. Monica came to the house that evening, walked through every room, and gave me a number. In a normal market, with proper staging and time, you could get $450,000 for this place. But you need to sell in a week. I have an investor who buys properties for cash. He'll probably offer $375,000, maybe $380,000 if the inspection goes well. I didn't care about the money. How fast can he close? If everything checks out? 7 days. Do it. While Monica handled the sale, I started the hardest part, packing up 12 years of my life. My brother Carlos took time off from his moving company to help me. He brought his crew, and we worked like people fleeing a natural disaster. I separated everything methodically. Thomas's belongings, every toy, every book, every piece of clothing, went into boxes marked for shipping to Portugal. My clothes, my computer, my design equipment, my grandmother's dishes, all the things I'd brought into the marriage, packed and ready to go. Everything else I left. The furniture we'd bought together, the decorations, Brandon's clothes, his golf clubs, his collection of expensive watches. I didn't take a single thing that was his or ours together. Monica arranged an estate sale company to come liquidate it all after I left. The hardest moment came when I was packing up our wedding photos. There we were, so young and happy, Brandon looking at me like I was his entire world. I'd been 22 years old and so sure I'd found my forever person. You okay, sis? Carlos asked gently. I looked at that young, naive version of myself in her white dress and felt sorry for her. She had no idea what was coming. I'm fine, just saying goodbye to someone I used to be. Brandon had never felt more alive than he did on this trip. The lake house was perfect. Huge windows overlooking the water, a speedboat tied to the dock, and best of all, no Nina nagging him about every little thing. He stretched out on the deck chair, beer in hand, watching Cassidy and her brother Justin race jet skis across the lake. "You look relaxed," Diane said, settling into the chair next to him. Cassidy's mother had been nothing but welcoming all week. "Much better than those pictures Cassidy showed me of you at your house. You always looked so tense there." Brandon nodded. "Nina doesn't really understand how to have fun anymore. Everything's always about Thomas or her little design projects. She doesn't get that I need to live a little too, you know." Diane patted his arm sympathetically. "Well, once you two make this official, you'll be part of our family. We know how to enjoy life." Official. Brandon hadn't actually told Nina he wanted a divorce yet, but he'd been thinking about it constantly this week. Why shouldn't he be with someone who made him happy? Someone young and exciting who didn't spend all day in sweatpants working from home? He'd already talked to a lawyer buddy from college who'd given him some advice about hiding assets before filing. Transfer money slowly into a separate account, undervalue possessions, maybe give some valuable items to friends to hold on to until after the divorce was settled. His buddy had warned him that Nina might get the house since her inheritance paid for most of it, but Brandon figured he could negotiate. Nina was soft. She'd probably accept whatever he offered just to avoid conflict. The 2 weeks flew by in a blur of barbecues, boat rides, and late nights in the hot tub. Cassidy draped herself over him constantly, and her family treated him like he was already Cassidy's husband. Her father Kevin taught him to fish. Justin treated him like a big brother, asking for career advice. Diane cooked enormous meals and took pictures of everyone together, posting them to Facebook with captions like, "Family time is the best time." Brandon felt a small twinge of guilt when he thought about Thomas. His son was a good kid and Brandon did love him. But he'd still see Thomas on weekends after the divorce. Kids were resilient. Thomas would adjust. And honestly, being a full-time dad was exhausting. Brandon looked forward to being the fun weekend dad instead. On the last night at the lake house, Cassidy's family threw a farewell dinner. Diane made a toast. To new beginnings, and to people brave enough to choose happiness. Everyone clinked glasses, and Brandon felt proud. He was brave. He was choosing happiness. The drive home took 6 hours. Brandon drove with Cassidy in the passenger seat, her parents and Justin in the back of his SUV. They played music loud and laughed about the best moments of the trip. Brandon felt loose and free in a way he hadn't felt in years. As they got closer to town, Cassidy started scrolling through the photos on her phone. "Look how good we look together," she said, showing her mother a selfie of them on the boat. "Brandon's so much more photogenic than I expected." "You should post that one," Diane said. "Let people see how happy you are." Brandon felt a flicker of worry. "Maybe wait until after I talk to Nina. I don't want her finding out about us from Facebook." Cassidy rolled her eyes. "Brandon, we've been together over a year. If she hasn't figured it out by now, she's blind." He supposed that was true. Nina never checked his phone, never questioned where he was. She was either incredibly trusting or incredibly stupid. Probably both. Brandon turned onto his street, already thinking about how he'd act when he saw Nina. Friendly but distant. He'd shower first, wash away any trace of Cassidy's perfume, then tell Nina he was tired from the trip and go to bed early. Tomorrow he'd start looking for a new apartment somewhere close enough to see Thomas, but far enough that Nina couldn't just drop by. Justin was telling a story about the fish that got away when Cassidy suddenly gasped. Brandon, stop the car." "What?" He was in the middle of the street, still 50 yards from his driveway. "Why is there a sold sign in your yard?" Time seemed to freeze. Brandon's brain couldn't process what Cassidy was saying. He looked up, and there it was. A big red and white Century 21 sign, stabbed into his front lawn with the word "sold" in huge letters across the top. "That's impossible," he whispered. His foot slipped off the brake, and the car rolled forward. He barely managed to pull into the driveway, his hands shaking so badly he could hardly grip the wheel. Everyone piled out of the car. Brandon walked toward his front door like he was in a dream. A bad dream. A nightmare. This couldn't be real. There had to be some explanation. Maybe Nina had finally agreed to sell and move somewhere bigger for Thomas. But she would have called him. She would have told him. He pulled out his keys, his hands trembling. The key slid into the lock but wouldn't turn. He tried again. Nothing. "The lock's not working," he said stupidly. Kevin stepped forward. "Let me try." But he couldn't get it to turn either. Brandon pressed his face against the window beside the door and felt his stomach drop into his feet. The house was empty. Completely empty. No couch, no TV, No dining table, no pictures on the walls, nothing. Just bare floors and blank walls and terrible, crushing emptiness. "What the hell is going on?" Cassidy demanded, her voice getting shrill. "Where's all your stuff? Where's your wife?" Brandon's phone was in his hand before he even realized he'd pulled it out. He called Nina. The call didn't even ring, just went straight to a recorded message. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." No, 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 he tried again. Same message. He opened his text messages and sent her a message. "Where are you? What did you do?" It showed delivered. But the little bubbles that meant she was typing never appeared. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped his phone as he opened his banking app. Joint checking account, closed. Savings account, closed. He clicked on the credit cards. Cancelled, cancelled, cancelled. Every single financial connection between him and Nina had been severed. "Brandon, you need to tell me what's happening right now," Cassidy said. She had her arms crossed and was looking at him the way you'd look at a stranger who'd just done something crazy. A silver Honda pulled up to the curb. A woman in a navy business suit got out, carrying a large manila envelope. She walked right up to Brandon like she'd been expecting to find him there. "Mr. Hartley?" "I'm Monica Reed with Century 21 Prestige Realty." She handed him the envelope with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I was asked to deliver this to you personally." Brandon's fingers felt numb as he opened the envelope. Inside were legal documents. So many legal documents. A petition for divorce. A restraining order preventing him from contacting Nina or Thomas, except through her attorney. Documentation showing that the house had been sold 9 days ago for $380,000 in cash. A letter from Patricia Wells, attorney at law, explaining that all proceeds from the sale had been placed in a trust fund for Thomas's future education and well-being, managed solely by Nina Carvalho. Carvalho. She'd already changed her name back. There was also a handwritten note on expensive cardstock. Just one sentence in Nina's neat handwriting. "You chose poorly." Brandon's legs stopped working. He sat down hard on the front step, which wasn't his front step anymore, because this wasn't his house anymore. Nothing was his. The ringing in his ears was so loud he almost didn't hear Cassidy's voice. "How did your wife sell your house without you knowing? How is that even legal?" She was practically screaming now. Diane's voice cut through the chaos cold and sharp. "Well, Brandon, I guess your wife wasn't as stupid as you thought she was." I woke up to sunshine streaming through the tall windows of my new apartment in Lisbon. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I heard the bells from the nearby cathedral and Thomas giggling in his room, and I remembered. This was my life now. My new, beautiful, Brandon-free life. I made coffee on my tiny balcony, looking out over the terracotta roofs and narrow cobblestone streets below. The air smelled like the ocean and fresh bread from the bakery downstairs. In the distance, I could see the red bridge that looked like San Francisco's Golden Gate stretching across the Tagus River. This view cost me less per month than our house payment had been back home. That fact alone made me smile every morning. Thomas padded out in his dinosaur pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "Mama, can we get those custard things again for breakfast?" "Pastel de nata," I said, pulling him onto my lap. "And yes, but first you need to get dressed for school." School. Thomas had been nervous about starting at an international school where half the classes were in Portuguese, but he'd taken to it like a duck to water. He came home teaching me Portuguese words, telling me about his new friends, Miguel and Sophia, and a British boy named Oliver who loved dinosaurs as much as Thomas did. My phone buzzed on the table. A message from Patricia. "Brandon's lawyer number 3 just quit. He's representing himself now. This is going even better than I hoped." I should have felt satisfaction, but mostly I just felt tired. 3 lawyers. Brandon had hired and lost 3 different attorneys in the past month because none of them would tell him what he wanted to hear, that there was some way to undo what I'd done. Another message from Patricia. "He's begging for visitation with Thomas. Says he'll accept all divorce terms if you allow supervised visits. What do you want me to tell him?" I looked at Thomas, who was now standing at the balcony railing, pointing excitedly at a cat walking along a roof below. My sweet boy who'd asked me only once why we left so suddenly, and when I'd explained that Mama and Daddy weren't going to be married anymore, he'd just nodded and asked if he could bring his stuffed triceratops to Portugal. I typed back, "No, not yet. When Thomas is older, he can decide if he wants contact." Was I being cruel? Maybe. But Brandon had chosen to spend 2 weeks playing house with another woman's family instead of being with his son. He'd made his choice. Now he could live with the consequences. My mother, Gabriela, arrived an hour later to watch Thomas while I worked. She'd been living in Lisbon for 5 years, ever since she'd retired and decided she was tired of cold winters. When I'd called her from the airport, sobbing and desperate, she'd simply said, "Come home, minha filha. You and Thomas come home. You look better," she said, kissing my cheek. "More colour in your face." "I feel better." And I did. The constant knot of anxiety I'd carried for months was finally gone. I wasn't wondering where Brandon was or who he was with. I wasn't checking his phone or smelling his shirts for unfamiliar perfume. I was just living. I worked all morning on a logo design for a restaurant in Austin, Texas. My business had actually grown since I'd moved. I'd started marketing myself as an international designer, and suddenly I had clients from 6 different countries. Turned out that leaving Brandon was the best business decision I'd ever made. Around noon, Patricia called instead of texting. That was never good. "I have news," she said. "Some good, some interesting. Tell me." "The good news? The divorce is finalized. You're officially Nina Carvalho again. The settlement is exactly what we wanted. Thomas's trust fund is protected. Brandon owes you $28,000 for money he spent on Cassidy during the affair, which he'll be paying off for years, and you have full custody with no visitation rights for him until Thomas requests it, and a Portuguese court approves." I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. And the interesting news? Brandon's company fired him. Apparently someone anonymously sent HR evidence that he was having an affair with a subordinate, which violated their ethics policy. He's been unemployed for 3 weeks. I should have felt guilty. Gerald had probably sent that evidence. I hadn't asked him to, but he was protective of his clients. But I couldn't make myself care. Brandon had made his choices. These were just the natural consequences. "There's more," Patricia continued. "Cassidy dumped him 4 days after he got back from that trip. Told people at their former workplace that she didn't sign up to date a broke homeless guy going through a messy divorce. She's apparently moved on to a senior manager at the same company. Married, of course. So Cassidy was exactly who I'd thought she was, a woman who chased married men for the thrill of it. Brandon had thrown away his family for someone who'd dropped him the second he became inconvenient. "How is he living?" I heard myself ask. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Nina, are you sure you want to know? Tell me." "He's in a motel off Highway 42, working at a call center. His parents tried to help him, but he told them to leave him alone, blamed them for not warning him you were crazy. They've reached out to me asking if they can have a relationship with Thomas. They claim they had no idea about the affair." Brandon's parents. Richard and Susan Hartley, who'd never quite thought I was good enough for their precious son. Who'd made comments about my weight after I had Thomas, about my career choice, about how I kept their grandchild from them even though they lived 40 minutes away and rarely made the effort to visit. But they were Thomas's grandparents, and if they were genuinely sorry, if they genuinely wanted to be in his life, did I have the right to keep them away? "Set up a video call," I said finally. "Supervised. If it goes well, we can talk about visits eventually." After I hung up, I sat on my balcony for a long time, thinking. My phone buzzed again, a message from a number I didn't recognize. My heart jumped, thinking maybe Brandon had gotten a new phone, but when I opened it, I saw it was from someone named Lauren. "Hi, Nina. You don't know me, but I'm friends with someone at your ex-husband's old company. I'm messaging because my cousin works there and she's going through what you went through. Cassidy is targeting her husband now. Same pattern, same tactics. Several women have come forward saying Cassidy has done this before. There's an internal investigation. I wanted you to know because women need to protect each other. I hope you're doing okay." I stared at the message for a long time. So Cassidy was a serial homewrecker, and Brandon had just been one in a line of married men she'd pursued. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated. See, it wasn't about me not being enough. Cassidy would have gone after him regardless. But mostly I just felt sad for all of us. For the wives who'd been betrayed. For the children caught in the middle. Even in a strange way for Brandon, who'd destroyed his life for a woman who never actually wanted him. I typed back to Lauren, "Thank you for letting me know. I hope your cousin gets through this. Tell her she's stronger than she thinks." That evening, Thomas and I walked down to the beach in Cascais, a 20-minute train ride from our apartment. We collected shells and built sandcastles while the sun set over the Atlantic. A man approached us, Ricardo, the architect I'd met at a cafe 3 weeks ago. He'd asked me to coffee and I'd said yes, surprising myself. "Nina, Thomas," Ricardo waved. He was kind and gentle, with laugh lines around his eyes. He treated me like I was something precious, like my opinions mattered, like I was interesting. It was strange and wonderful. "Ricardo!" Thomas ran to him, showing off a perfect spiral shell he'd found. Ricardo knelt down to Thomas's level, examining it seriously. "This is a very special shell," Ricardo said in his accented English. "I think it's magic." Thomas giggled. "Shells aren't magic." "No? Then how did it become so perfect?" I watched them together and felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Not for Ricardo necessarily, though he was lovely. But hope that maybe I could trust again someday. That maybe what Brandon did to me didn't have to define the rest of my life. That night, after Thomas was asleep, I pulled out my laptop and opened a document I'd been working on. My story. All of it. I'd been thinking about sharing it online, hoping it might help other women who were where I'd been. My phone buzzed. Patricia again. Brandon's mother called. She wants to send Thomas Christmas presents. Thoughts? I smiled and typed, "Yes, but they ship to Portugal. This is our home now." 6 months had passed since the day I'd watched Brandon's face crumble through the living room window. 6 months since I'd boarded a plane with Thomas and left everything behind. Sometimes it felt like a lifetime ago. Sometimes it felt like yesterday. I was sitting in a cafe near the waterfront, working on a branding project for a tech startup in London, when my phone rang. Lauren, the woman who'd warned me about Cassidy's pattern of targeting married men. "Nina, I thought you'd want to know. Cassidy got fired. The investigation found she'd been using her position to pursue relationships with married superiors, and there were complaints from other women in the office about her behavior. She's trying to claim discrimination, but apparently the evidence was overwhelming." I thanked Lauren and hung up, waiting to feel something. Victory? Satisfaction? But there was nothing. Cassidy had destroyed her own career through her own choices. I hadn't needed to do anything. Karma, it seemed, didn't need my help. The divorce papers had arrived last week, stamped and finalised by both courts, American and Portuguese. I'd held them in my hands, these official documents that said I was no longer Mrs. Hartley, and felt lighter than I had in years. Nina Carvalho, my mother's name, my name now. The settlement was everything Patricia had promised. Thomas's trust fund, $380,000 from the house sale plus investments, was protected and growing. Brandon owed me $28,000 for the money he'd spent on Cassidy, paid in monthly installments of $200 that would take him over 10 years to finish. He had no custody, no visitation rights, and wouldn't until Thomas was old enough to request it himself, and a Portuguese family court approved supervised visits. Brandon's parents had been video calling with Thomas once a week for the past month. The first call had been awkward, with Richard and Susan apologising stiffly while Thomas showed them his dinosaur collection, oblivious to the tension. But they'd been consistent, never missing a scheduled call, always asking about Thomas's school and friends. Last week, Susan had cried when Thomas sang her a Portuguese song he'd learned. "Can Grandma and Grandpa visit sometime?" Thomas had asked me after the last call. "Maybe," I'd said. "We'll see how things go." I was learning to separate Brandon's parents from Brandon himself. They'd been blind to their son's faults, but they genuinely loved Thomas. And Thomas deserved grandparents who cared about him. My business was thriving in ways I'd never imagined. I had a waiting list of clients and had just hired a junior designer in Brazil to help with overflow work. I'd raised my rates twice and clients still kept coming. Turned out that when you weren't constantly distracted by a failing marriage, you could actually focus on building something meaningful. Ricardo and I had been seeing each other for 4 months now. He was patient with my wariness, never pushing for more than I was ready to give. He brought Thomas books about Portuguese architecture and taught him to draw buildings. He held my hand while we walked along the river and told me stories about growing up in Porto. He never once made me feel like I wasn't enough. "I'm not trying to replace Thomas's father," he'd said once. "I just want to be someone good in both of your lives." That was all I needed to hear. Thomas was flourishing. His Portuguese was getting better than mine. He had friends from 6 different countries at his international school. Last week he'd asked me if we could stay in Lisbon forever because he loved it here. I'd held him tight and promised him this was our home now. We weren't going anywhere. My mother still lived 10 minutes away and had become Thomas's favourite person. She picked him up from school twice a week, teaching him to make Portuguese dishes and taking him to parks I'd played in as a child during the summers we'd visited her family. Watching her with Thomas, I realized she was happier too. She'd left her own unhappy marriage years ago, and seeing me do the same had created a new bond between us. "You did what I should have done 20 years earlier," she'd told me once. "You chose yourself and your child. I'm so proud of you, Mina Fila." I'd started writing my story in a private blog, mostly for myself, a way to process everything that had happened. But last week I'd made it public. I called it The Woman Who Disappeared: How I Sold My House and Started Over. The response had been overwhelming. Thousands of views in 3 days. Hundreds of comments from women sharing their own stories of betrayal and escape. Some were still stuck, afraid to leave. I responded to as many as I could, offering encouragement, sharing Patricia's name for those who needed a fierce attorney, reminding them that they were stronger than they knew. One message stood out. It was from a woman named Jennifer, whose husband had been cheating with a co-worker for 2 years. She'd been planning to confront him, to beg him to choose their family. After reading my story, she'd contacted a lawyer instead. "You showed me I didn't have to beg someone to value me," she wrote. "You showed me I could choose myself. Thank you." I cried reading that. If my pain could help even one woman find her strength, then maybe it had all been worth something. Patricia called one afternoon while I was picking Thomas up from school. "I have news about Brandon. His parents wanted me to tell you." My stomach tightened. "What happened?" "He's in therapy. Started about a month ago. Apparently he had some kind of breakdown at work, the call center job, and his manager insisted he get help. His parents are paying for it since he can't afford it himself." I didn't know how to feel about that. Was he actually trying to deal with what he'd done, or was this just another attempt to make himself look better? "His therapist suggested he write you a letter," Patricia continued. "Not to send, just as part of his work. But he asked his parents if they thought you'd ever read it. They said they'd ask me to ask you." "No," I said immediately. Then I paused. "Actually, wait. Is it an apology letter or is it him making excuses?" "His mother says it's an apology. But Nina, you don't owe him anything, not even reading his words." She was right. I didn't owe Brandon anything. But part of me was curious. Part of me wanted to know if he actually understood what he'd destroyed. "Tell him he can send it to you. You can read it first. If it's genuine, you can forward it to me. If it's garbage, delete it." 2 weeks later, Patricia called again. "I read the letter. It's actually pretty honest. No excuses, just acknowledgement of what he did and how it affected you and Thomas. He doesn't ask for anything. No forgiveness, no contact, nothing. Just says he's sorry and he understands why you'll never trust him again. Send it to me." The letter was 3 pages long. Brandon described the therapy sessions where he'd had to face what he'd done. How he'd convinced himself that Nina was boring and Cassidy was exciting, when really he'd just been selfish and immature. How he'd thrown away the best thing in his life because he'd wanted to feel young and desired. How he thought about Thomas every day and knew he'd failed as a father. He didn't make excuses about Cassidy manipulating him or his parents not raising him right. He owned every choice he'd made. At the end, he wrote, "I know I can never fix what I broke. I know Thomas deserves better than a father who chose a 2-week vacation over 12 years of marriage. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that you were right to leave. You were right about everything. I hope you're happy now. I hope Thomas is happy. You both deserve happiness, and I'm sorry it took losing you to understand what I had." I read it 3 times. Then I saved it in a folder and closed my laptop. Maybe one day I'd show it to Thomas when he was old enough to understand. Maybe Brandon would actually become the person he claimed to want to be. Maybe not. Either way, it wasn't my problem anymore. That evening, I stood on my balcony watching the sunset paint Lisbon in shades of gold and pink. Thomas was inside with Ricardo, both of them building an elaborate castle out of blocks. My mother was making dinner in the kitchen, singing along to Portuguese fado music. This was my life now. Messy and complicated and beautiful and mine. I'd started as a woman who'd lost everything, but I'd become a woman who'd chosen to save herself. And that made all the difference.